Well, we're continuing on with our sermon series called Dark Gods, and we're looking at the ways that idolatry affects our life. And the reason this is important for us is because there's a tendency for us to see idolatry, like in the Old Testament, as something that really doesn't apply to us, because most of the time we don't look at, statues or something like that. But it's important to understand that an idol is just a god that you have the measure of. It's a god that is taken on the shape that you have given it. And that is not adequate for our lives. And so we want to go over all the ways that this affects us. We're going to be in Psalm 145 today, if you'd like to turn there. We're going to talk about alternative identities today, the idol of our alternative identities. And no, this is not a sermon about pronouns. Not a sermon about pronouns. This is a sermon about how whatever God that we worship, that ends up bringing us our identity. And the problem is that a lot of times we find our identity in things that are other than God. In fact, that's incredibly common. In fact, if somebody asks, well, who are you? Or if somebody asks about somebody else, well, who is this person? Who is this friend of yours? Who is it, whatever? We all have ways of describing that person's identity. The problem is that most of those descriptors are accurate in some way. The issue comes in where we put those descriptors and how high those are in our lives. What do I mean by that? I mean, you might be, let's say you're an engineer. You can be a father. You can be an engineer. You can be, maybe you're a Republican. Maybe you're a Democrat. Maybe you're an independent. You can be a photographer. You can be a philanthropist. You can be, there's a number of ways that you can describe yourself, and none of those are necessarily there's anything wrong with it. The problem is that in any one of those categories, in any one of those identities, where do those identities fall in comparison to being a child of God? You see what I'm saying? Like all of these things about you might be true, but how important are they? If you get right down to it and you say, I'll have every identity stripped from me, and I can only have one left, what are you going to choose? And it doesn't even have to be something like, a formal position. You can just, maybe you think of yourself as a winner. I'm a winner. And when it comes down to it, I'm going to be a winner. And that's what's important to me. So no matter what game I'm playing, no matter what business I'm in, I'm going to win. That's what's important to me. Maybe you see yourself as a loser. Hopefully not. But maybe you do. Maybe that becomes your ultimate identity, and really, in reality, you'll end up giving up everything in your life except for that. That becomes the foundation of how you view yourself. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, these identities are very important to us, but the question is where do they fall in relationship to our standing with God? What is most important in our life? So in Psalm 145, we're going to read verses 1 through 6. It says, I will extol you, O God and King. I will bless your name forever and ever. Every day I will bless you and praise your name forever and ever. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. One generation shall commend your works to another, and shall declare your mighty acts. On the glorious splendor of your majesty, and on your wondrous works I will meditate. They shall speak of the might of your awesome deeds, and I will declare your greatness. So the psalmist here, what was their identity? If you said, describe yourself, who are you? What's the most important thing to them? Would they say, I'm a shepherd? I'm a son? I'm a father? Or would they say that I'm a child of God, the King of kings and the Lord of lords? That the most important aspect of my life is that I give praise and glory to God, and that is the highest honor of my life. That is the highest attribute of who I am, and that is the greatest thing that can be said about me. And I will give everything up before I give that up. What we'll see as we look at these alternative identities is that there are three things that we want to look at today. The first thing that we're going to look at and cover is the worship problem, because there is a great problem there. We're secondly going to look at identities in question. And then lastly, we're going to look at standing in awe. And so I think all of these will relate back to this passage in the Psalms and help us to understand why the idols in our life can be very hard to understand, they're hard to see, and they're hard to grapple with, but they're also incredibly important to our outcome. So let's talk about the worship problem. If we were going to ask, well, what's wrong with the world? Does any of us have any ideas? Can any of us shed any light on what's wrong with the world? If I said to you, what's wrong with the world, does anything come to mind? Or you say, after giving it a lot of thought, it seems like things are pretty much perfect. Probably that's not the answer we would come up with. Most of us would probably come up with maybe one or two things. If we're really pressed, we could come up with a list of one or two things that are wrong with the world. Now, the problem is that if we put all of our lists together, I don't know where worship would fall into that category. Like how many times would we come up with that? Well, what's really wrong with the world is worship. We've messed up worship. For most of us, that wouldn't probably even rate on the list, and that's unfortunate. Wrong worship seems to be far from the priority of our problems. We have inequality, the environment, human trafficking, sexual exploitation, the war in Ukraine. I mean, you could go on and on. Inflation. But if we're really being honest and we're going to delve deep into what causes all of those problems, I think that what we would find if we picked up the thread of any of those problems and we followed it to its termination, what we would find is that wrong worship is the problem in our world. And not only is it the problem in our world, it's also the problem in our lives as individuals. How many of us can imagine waking up one day to have our neighbor pounding on our door, and when we go to the door, that neighbor has a machete and a bunch of his friends and family members, and the negotiation is, how much will you give us to kill you quickly? I mean, that's a pretty dark scenario. That's an incredibly dark scenario, and yet it's the scenario that happened in the country of Rwanda in the 90s. You guys remember that? It was a terrible, terrible thing to see unfold on the news, and yet that's what happened, is people who had been neighbors for sometimes most of their lives, knew each other incredibly well, all of a sudden had those same neighbors who they believed that they knew and that they cared about and they could trust, show up on their doorstep and were there to kill them. And there was no negotiating with them. There was no, hey, but we've known each other our whole lives. We grew up together. We've known each other. We're neighbors. We cared about each other. We've been over to each other's houses. How is this? And there was imagine no talking. Imagine your neighbor. Think of somebody who you get along with and like, and imagine there is no amount of negotiation that you can bring to the table. They are going to kill you no matter what. How terrible must that scenario have been? And you think, well, why? How did they get there? The reason they got there was the wrong worship. That people held the wrong thing in high esteem. They had the wrong value system. They held up as praiseworthy the wrong things. They worshiped the wrong God. We talked about a couple weeks ago the idea of being motivated. That everything is motivated by love of something. And that love, when you get down to it, when you love something that's above you, that love looks like worship. And when you love something that's below you, that love looks like helpfulness. And so really what happens is, when we get it down to its bare essence, that everything in the world, everything in our lives that happens because of our worship. Worship is the fundamental thing that takes place in the world around us and motivates everything that happens. Somebody decides that they're going to open up the next best pizza restaurant. And they might be motivated by the worship of serving a customer. Or they might be motivated by the worship of making money. But they're motivated by holding something in high esteem, and they're going to follow that, and they're going to put every ounce of effort into it. I was reading an article recently about Amazon and how their highest order, their highest value is serving the customer, pleasing the customer. What can we do to make the customer's life better? And that nothing else really matters. Now, you might love Amazon. There might not be anything better to you than than when you show up at your front door and you see the big smile on the box that's sitting there and you know that your orders come in. I mean, personally, I enjoy that quite a bit. Or you might hate Amazon. You might think, well, they're doing terrible things to the local economy, to local businesses, to mom and pop shops. You might love them, you might hate them. But what you'll see is that the fact that Amazon worships this thing, this ideal, this value, and it doesn't care about anything else, those have some positive effects and some negative effects. That when we choose the thing to be motivated by, that we've chosen, in fact, to set the course of our entire life. And that's true for things out in the world, but it's also true in your life. You experience frustration, I'm sure. And I've experienced frustration this week. I was working on a project. I watched videos on YouTube. I knew how to do it. And yet, somehow, it didn't quite go the way that I was expecting. In fact, this week, we talked last week. Let me get something real quick. Oh, it's gone. Never mind. There was a little blue box over here. And I was going to show it to you. Last week, our lights went out. This week, Josh spent yesterday it's back there. Chad's holding it up. That little blue box right there is the source of all of our problems. It took Josh, I don't know, something like 4 hours to find out the problem and then another 4 hours to figure out a way around it because we don't have another one of those laying around. And in fact, they don't make that anymore. We have to buy something else and we have to wait for it to get here and all that kind of stuff. But what you'll see is that we have limited lighting today. We got out our very old lighting controller that has 24 channels. Recently, we've been running about 400 channels of lighting. That's why it looks like this. But, 4 hours to figure out that little box was the problem. How many of you guys have had days like that? It's frustrating, isn't it? It is so frustrating. The pool pump stops working. I remember one time the pool pump stopped working at our house, and there was a rock inside of the system. And my sons told me that Jed had been the culprit. And I didn't believe that this was true until I saw, actually with my own eyes, I saw our dog Jed pick up a rock from the side. We had these like river rocks that were like this big. He picked up a rock from the side of the pool in his mouth, walked over to the pool, and did that. And watched it. Thought it was fascinating to watch it go all the way to the bottom. And I thought, you dumb dog, I could just strangle the life out of you right now. Then I learned, this happened after the boys became adults and no longer feared me, that the reason that might have happened, but they just got lucky, because the real reason at the time that it happened, the real reason there was a rock in the pool, is because the boys decided to try to skip rocks in our pool. They blamed it on Jed and then got lucky that he actually, I guess from watching them, I don't know. But I was so frustrated. I was so mad. I was so upset. Now, but here's the thing. You experience that, but that's not going to be the only thing you're going to experience. No, because that's not how frustrations work. They come in groups. Then your kids are going to not get their homework done. You're going to find out that they haven't been doing their homework and that more punishment should work, but, the last round of punishment didn't, but maybe more will work, and so you try that. You find, maybe your job's not satisfying, maybe everything's boring, maybe including your church life. All these things are going on in your life. You've got all this frustration in your life. Things are not the way that you want them. And almost all the time, this revolves around our view of ourselves and the identities we see for ourselves. This shouldn't be happening to me because I'm this kind of person. I'm good at home improvement, so this shouldn't be happening. I'm better at this than this. My life should look different than it does. Why? Because this is not who I am. My life shouldn't be this boring. It shouldn't have this lack of purpose and meaning. I shouldn't be this unmotivated. That's not who I am. And in reality, what we'll find is, if we pull that string and follow it to its termination, that we're worshiping the wrong things. I can't even name the number of times that I've been frustrated in my life. And if I pull on that thread of frustration, what I will find is that the pursuit of success in my life is getting in the way of the pursuit of God. What do I mean by that? I mean that most of the time when we get an unexpected result and we experience frustration, it's because we're worshiping the result and not the God who is in charge of dispensing the results. Job was an interesting guy. Job had a successful life. In fact, the story of Job opens up with him having this successful life. He's very successful, and then what happens is his life is thrown into a tailspin. And why is it thrown into a tailspin? Well, he's got good reason for that, right? Everything that Job has gets lost, and that shouldn't be the way that it happens. Why? Because Job's a good guy. Job's a successful guy. Job's a family guy. I'm a family man. This shouldn't be happening to me. I'm a successful man. This shouldn't be happening to me. I'm a friend of God. This shouldn't be happening to me. This shouldn't be happening to me. But when you trace that thread, there's this idea of who I am and therefore what I should be able to expect out of life. I was listening to an actor named Michael Rosenbaum. And he has a podcast, and he interviews other actors. And I don't remember the actor that he was interviewing at this time, but I remember listening to this actor who was talking about how he pursued, just with everything in him, he pursued getting to the top and finding success. And then he said he was so heartbroken when he got to the top, there was nothing there. He had everything that he ever wanted in life. He was successful. He was making amazing money. He was well known. He had everything. He had fame, fortune. He was young. He was good looking. He had everything. And then when he got there, nothing was satisfying to him. And he couldn't understand that because that's not the kind of person he is. He's an actor. He's a celebrity. He's a star. He's full of youth and energy. He's full of all kinds of great skills and charm, and yet nothing's there. Job experiences this great loss in his life, and he doesn't know why. And so he's asking his friends, why is this happening to me? And the answer that Job gets is mystifying. After listening to Job and listening to his friends, God decides that he will give an answer. But the problem is that for thousands of years, people have looked at this answer and scratched their heads and wondered, well, what is going on with this answer? In Job 38, verse 4 through 7, it says, "Where were you?" This is God speaking to Job. "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurement? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" You know, that's a really interesting answer, and it's interesting for what it doesn't say for as much as what it does say, because in the end, God never tells Job why. I mean, we as the readers know. We know that Satan and God had a conversation, and in fact, God pointed out Job, "Hey, have you considered my servant Job?" And Satan goes, "Well, yeah, he only likes you because you're being successful." It's kind of like he's got this idol in his life. Now, we don't know if that's an actual idol or just is possible that it is. We know that Satan kind of points it out. He's basically what Satan says to God is, "God, Job's not worshiping you." In fact, he says it's not for nothing that he worships you. He worships you because you've given him all this great blessing and success. Basically, Satan is suggesting, whether it's true or not, that Job has an idol in his life, and that idol is success. And that if you take that success away, that Job will no longer worship God. And in God's answer, what's interesting is what basically God says is, look, the world is so much more more than you know. It's more than you know. It's more complicated. It's more magnificent. It's more full of grandeur. It's more full of glory. It's more wonderful. It's more everything than you can possibly know. In fact, when I was making this world, when its bases were sunk, when its cornerstone was laid, then the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. What's interesting is, did these things know what was going on? Did these morning stars, did the sons of God that shouted for joy, did they understand it all, or did they just see it and experience joy? Because there's something connected here, which is a very strange and fascinating thing. What leads the sons of joy, or the sons of God, to shout for joy? What leads them to shout for joy? God's making this thing, and my guess is that it's so wonderful that they can't even comprehend the nature of it, and yet they shout for joy. God does something unexpected, and they shout for joy. Why? Why didn't they say, God, do you know what you're doing? God, are you sure about this? God, I don't see where this is going. God, I don't know. God, why don't you tell me what's happening, and then I'll decide whether I'm going to shout for joy or not, because I'm not sure where this is heading. No, they experience something unexpected and they shout for joy. Why? Because they know God and they can trust Him. Even if they don't understand what's going on, they can trust God. Why? Because they don't have something else set up as an idol. God is God to them. And they don't have an idol there of success. What difference does it make whether this is successful or not? If God is doing it, it's worth shouting for joy about. What difference does it make if it makes us look great or makes us look terrible? What difference does it make what the outcome is if this is something that God is doing? Is it not worthy of our praise? Is it not worthy of joy? God is doing something amazing. Here's the thing that I've come to understand today. Tomorrow I will forget about this. I assure you. Tomorrow you could come by here. I'll be working to finish the project that's not going well. I will be doing that tomorrow. If you come by here tomorrow, who knows what you might hear? Who knows? Because I guarantee you that at some point tomorrow I will experience an unexpected result and I will be frustrated. And I can tell you that the reason for my frustration will be that I have set up success as an idol. And because I'm not getting that success, I am frustrated and I am angry and I am upset. Because I can tell you this, that if I allowed God to be God and I were to worship Him for who He is, it would not matter what the outcome of that is. Because if I can trust God, if He is who He says He is, and I can trust Him, then no matter whether I succeed tomorrow or whether I fail, it is a mark of the love of God for me. How many times in your life has God allowed you to fail and then turn that into grace for you? How many times? Has it ever happened to you? Has it ever happened that you fell on your face and yet God somehow had the grace to show you something that you needed to know? One of the greatest experiences of grace that I ever had in my life was the time that I got fired from a job. And all of the time, this happens to us all of the time. And yet somehow what happens is every time, the next time I experience this frustration in my life, I have to learn this lesson over again. I don't know about you guys, but I am a hard-headed person, and I do not learn my lessons very well. And every time God has to take me through failure to say, look, success should not be your God here, because if you let success be your God, then you will be captive to that. The only time you will be happy is in the midst of success. And when you actually reach success, because it's not tied to anything greater or more meaningful, it will not give you what you want. Ask the actor that Michael Rosenbaum was interviewing. That success wasn't tied to anything higher or greater, and so it meant nothing. You see, the problem is that we take these pieces of our identity, and none of these pieces are bad things. In fact, the reality is that we very rarely turn bad things into idols. We almost always turn good things into idols. I can take, being a father or being a husband or being a pastor or being, a citizen of the United States. I can take any of those things. Those are good things. But the problem is that when I take them and I elevate them to the top, and I isolate them from God, and God is no longer putting them in their proper place. They're no longer integrated into something that God recognizes as good. That those things become idols to me, and those things get robbed of the meaning and value they could have had, and they become a snare and a stumbling block in my life. There are things that are more complicated in the world than we can possibly know. And God fits them into a life and a reality that is glorious. And so, if we held Him up as the highest thing, then we can experience joy and worship in the midst of outcomes that are unexpected. The second thing that we need to understand is that we have identities in question. And this is really important for us to understand, because when we choose an identity, when we choose an idol, when we choose something that we worship, we have chosen our outcome. And the reason for this is simple. The Bible makes it clear that we become what we worship. And I can't emphasize this enough. We become what we worship. And it can't be any other way. I once knew a guy who was really into marketing and sales and stuff like that, and he would spend all of his time listening to lectures by salesmen, and he had cassette after cassette after cassette of these, and he just had them in rotation in his car, at home. He would just listen to them over and over and over. Now, here's the thing: he loved sales. There's nothing wrong with that. Being a salesman can be a great thing. But the problem is that he started to elevate it higher than he should, to the point where everything in his life became a sales job. And being a salesman is a good calling if it's put in order by a God who has ordered everything. But if it's taken out of that and it's elevated to an idol, it can become a snare in our lives. The people around him began to wonder, when was he just selling them something, and when was he expressing what was really in his heart? Now, I'm glad to say that as he grew closer to God, he reordered his loves and reordered his life. And it was interesting to see how all the things that he had learned from all of those sale things actually started to become a great asset to him, because it was used in a proper way. He had the ability to be charming when all those things were used authentically. You see, the problem is that we become what we worship. Because worship is the driver behind every action in your life. It's involved in every thought that you think. Because you wouldn't be thinking that thought unless you valued what that thought was connected to. And it really sets everything in your life towards its natural conclusion. How many of you guys remember Bernie Madoff? It's crazy to understand just how big of a scam that guy perpetrated. I had forgotten about this. I was looking at this week, that his scam was in the neighborhood of $65 billion. $65 billion. And what I didn't know at the time, and I learned through my research, and it's a terribly sad story, is that his sons apparently were completely unaware that all of this was a scam. They thought their dad was just super successful. And what happened was, he came to them and he said, hey, people were going to get bonuses this year. I'm going to pay those bonuses out early. And it was like $143 million worth of bonuses that he was paying out to people in his organization. And they were like, Dad, why are you doing this early? This is so much money. And I guess in that moment, he confessed to them that everything was a lie. And this was basically the last $143 million he had. And he wanted to distribute that to the people in his employ. And for the first time, they learned that their dad was not a genius, a financial genius, but he was nothing but a con artist. And the two sons went immediately, I guess that was the last conversation they ever had with their father. They went immediately to the authorities because they had to try to make right what he had done. And one of the saddest aspects to this story is that on the anniversary of their father being arrested 2 years later, one of the sons, Mark, committed suicide because his life had been so destroyed over what his father had done. If you ask Bertie Madoff, who are you? What would he have said? I'm a businessman. I'm an investor. I'm successful. Where would he have ranked those identities in comparison to his relationship with God? Clearly, those things were much more important. And so, he was sentenced to something like 120 years in prison and died there. And his son, being so distraught and having his life completely wrecked, his son could never get a job after that moment, chose to end his life. You see, the part of the problem that we have to understand is that because we become what we worship, you have to choose something that's big enough. And the problem is that we were not made for something small. You see, your identity will always be something that is unfulfilling if you choose to have a God that is too small. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 9, there's a great passage here. This is Solomon who writes about basically life here and the difficulties of life. And Solomon asks in verse 9, what gain has the worker from his toil? What gain has the worker? What is the point of working? How many of you guys have ever experienced that? I spent a few nights thinking those same thoughts in the kitchen at JB's restaurant, in the dish room at JB's restaurant, in the aisles of Kmart. How many of you ever had those experiences? What is the point of all this? He continues in verse 10, I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. So Solomon's asking this question, and the question is really, what's the point of all this? It's easy to say, well, there's nothing, because one of the things that the wisdom literature in the Bible does is it takes everything and it makes the case as hard as possible. It takes the hardest possible look at things. And one of the things that happens is, what good is the toil of man? Because everything that you do will just be undone eventually. Like we can spend time as a congregation building up this church. Eventually it will be a pile of rubble and weeds will grow over it. Eventually everything that you do, why make the bed when it's going to get unmade? It's that writ large, okay? And so the question is here, what's the gain as the worker from his toil? And here's the thing, if you choose as your identity, I'm a worker, I'm a guy who gets things done, I'm a worker, in the end, the problem with choosing that as your identity is, where does that go? In the end, all of the things that you do will be completely undone. So why would you choose that as an identity? You see, the problem is that all of the idols that we choose are just slices of good things that we try to blow up big enough to fulfill us. And what Solomon's saying here is that doesn't work, because what is the gain? What gain does the worker have from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in his time. Also, he has put eternity into man's hearts. See, the problem is that all of these things that we can choose to be idols, they're small slices of things. They're finite. You can choose to be, I'm a worker, I'm a this, I'm a that, but all of that will be undone. And then where will you be? You see, God has put eternity in your hearts. You need something bigger to found your identity on. You need a bigger God. And so he says, God has put eternity in the hearts, into man's hearts. Yet, so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. You see, here's the thing. God put eternity in your hearts, and you're never going to reach the end of God. Let me read that verse again, verse 11 of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity in men's hearts, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. God has put eternity in your hearts, and he is an eternal God. That means you will never, ever reach the end of who he is. He is the only God that's big enough for you to found your identity on. Yes, being a worker will be part of what you do, but everything that you do will be undone. But that's okay, because that's only a part of who you are. And because the work you do is connected to a God that's eternal, what you do matters, even though it passes away. My sons are no longer children. I don't have to, when they told me that they threw rocks into the pool, I did not try to ground them. I did not say, when you go home to your barracks, because in the time they told me they were in the military, you will stay in your barracks, young man. You will write me sentences and mail them to me. I will not throw rocks in the pool. I didn't try to do, you know why I didn't try to do that? Because the lessons that I taught, even though those lessons will fade away, the impact that it has on them does not. Verse 12 says, I perceive that there's nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take his pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. So why can you find any satisfaction if being a worker isn't going to fully fulfill you because all the things you do are going to fade away? Well, then how come it has any benefit to you at all? Because it's connected to God, and God doesn't fade away. You see, the small things add up when you have God at the top, because they're connected to God, because they point to something bigger. You see, you can be an actor and be completely fulfilled in what you do because it has meaning and purpose because it's connected to God, or you can be an actor who feels completely unfulfilled in his life because you have made that the highest thing, you have made that God, your God, and it doesn't go anywhere, and eventually every role you take will be lost to time. Solomon sees that because God is put at the top, these identities actually come together to make something great. The finite points to the infinite, and so it finds meaning and purpose. But if the finite points to nothing but itself, it is completely unsatisfying. Without this, there is no joy in the finite. God is the King of kings and the Lord of lords, and he is over every spiritual and physical thing in the world. And so when we make him our God, we're going to be part of our identity will be things like being a father, being a husband, being a worker. And all those things will complete a fulfilling identity because all of them are wrapped up in being his child, and they will point to something bigger and something higher. And finally, even though we're out of time, it just turned. It was 11:30. I was still good. Now it's 11:31 and we're done. Let's talk about standing in awe, because if we don't get this, we miss everything. In Psalm 145, it says, I will extol you, my God and King, and bless your name forever and ever. Every day I will bless you and praise your name forever and ever. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. One generation shall commend your works to another, and shall declare your mighty acts. On the glorious splendor of your majesty and on your wondrous works I will meditate. They shall speak of the might of your awesome deeds, and I will declare your greatness. You see, when this is your identity, and everything that you have points to this, then you have something of value to stand on, because God's greatness is the greatest thing that could exist. There is nothing better. There's not even the possibility of anything better. There is nothing greater than the greatness of God. And when you find that your life points to that, then the interesting thing is it doesn't matter some of the details. I might completely fail tomorrow in this project, but if I remember this, if God is glorified through my failure, then I can rejoice in it. I don't have to be frustrated. I don't have to go around angry, and I don't have to go around upset, because if God is glorified in my failure, then what more could I ask for? Whether I succeed or fail doesn't matter. What matters is that God is glorified. And in our lives, sometimes we will do so great and we will be standing on the top, and sometimes we will be in the midst of the valley where everything seems pointless. But in the end, if God is glorified, then all of it comes together. In Psalm chapter 96, verse 11 and 12, it says, "Let the heavens be glad and let the earth rejoice. Let the sea roar and all that fills it. Let the field exult and everything in it. Then shall all the trees of the forest sing for joy." Here's the thing that's interesting. How many people do you know that feel like their lives don't have any meaning or purpose? Do you guys know people like that? Maybe you've been people like that. Maybe you're struggling with that right now. But in this psalm, it says, "Let the heavens be glad, let the earth rejoice. Let the sea roar, let the field exult." Have you ever seen a field? Do you think, that field's got things together? One of these days, I'm going to be as good as that field over there. Do you ever do that? Do you ever envy the field? You say, man, if I was only like this field over here, then my life would mean something. No, you don't do that. The thing that's amazing to me is that the Bible can speak of things like that. The Bible can speak of the field exalting. If the Bible can speak of the field exalting, then why do we struggle finding meaning and purpose in our life? The field exalts because it's doing what it was meant to do. It's glorifying God. And yet we who are so much more full of power and so much full of majesty and so much full of glory, we don't get to experience that because we don't have the right God. In Psalm 145, every day is spent extolling and meditating on the glory of God. It's not spent on agonizing over a to-do list. Do you understand the difference? If we spend our time meditating on the glory of God, we will have a different life than if we meditate every day on our to-do list. So how do we learn from this? What do we take away? How do we apply this? Well, we have to believe in God's glory. It's important that we meditate on it day and night. Meditate on the glory of God every day. You're going to have to think about your to-do list eventually, but it's going to look different in light of your meditation on God's glory. Believe me, it will. It will look different. We need to belong to Him through the covenant. What does it mean? Or what does a relationship with Him look like? So if we meditate on God and His glory, then the next thing is, well, what does my relationship with Him look like then? What does it mean to have a relationship with the God of the universe? That bears some thinking about. I mean, how many of you guys got baptized? Anyone here got baptized? And I got baptized as a kid, and I didn't spend a lot of time thinking, hey, I'm entering into a covenant with God. He's the creator of the universe and the God of all majesty and glory, the King of kings and Lord of lords. I wonder what that means for my life. I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about that. Maybe I should have, but I have the opportunity to do it now. Let's do that together. What does it mean to be the image of Him? What does it mean to have a relationship with Him? And finally, become glorious by becoming transformed to His goal of glory. How does this motivate your actions? How does it become a source of joy? It bears thinking about this week. How do we make that work in our lives? Because God has given us the greatest identity possible. We are sons and daughters of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Hey, have a great week.